kind of withdrawal, didn't even accelerate it. Trump did the same thing. And now we're in the final days.
So it was merely a matter of mission creep, all things considered.
I think that's a touch of an oversimplification, but really only a touch. The plan worked. We just decided to then have a second plan, and the second plan was a bad idea.
All right. So I wanted to ask your thoughts in that case on the correlation of the forever war, how it's sort of dominated public perception recently.
Well, they're over, so they're not forever. Yeah. There is a theoretical possibility, although I'm not sure it's like the majority chance, that if we had left back in 2004, 2005, that Iraq would be in a much better position now than it was then. Afghanistan would not have been. Afghanistan, the only time that Afghanistan has ever had a functional government is when every single country around it has been in chaos or civil war. It's a stateless area, and there is no way that we can beat it into any shape that we're going to like. So the only debate to be had from a security point of view is whether or not you leave a small footprint there to look out for trouble with enough kinetic power to drop the hammer on things that you think are going to be trouble. The problem with that theory is that it will always generate trouble. There are large portions of the world that geographically are simply incapable of sustaining what we consider to be a modern government, much less a democratic one. And Afghanistan is one of those. So you're either actively managing it badly or you're leaving it alone. And I don't mean to suggest that I have like the golden keys to a solution here. If it was easy, we would have done it 15 years ago. But the American people are simply done. Now, will that come back to bite us in the ass? It might, but honestly, Afghanistan being a stateless area is more a problem for the countries that border it than for us.
Well, that brings me to the question of what exactly has this focus on the Middle East since 2005 accomplished?
Nothing. It's shattered a number of the secular institutions that ran the country and has either thrown them into chaos or made the Islamic groups far more powerful. And basically, we've been stirring the omelet, trying to turn it into a souffle, and it just hasn't worked. Now, moving forward, we're going to have a very different picture now that the U.S. is done. I mean, we're looking at a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan within a few weeks at this point. CENTCOM headquarters in Qatar are going to close probably within a year because there's nothing for them to coordinate anymore. And the general American footprint in the entire region is evaporating. And I'd even say even odds that places like Incirlik are going to get closed down because they don't support anything anymore, which means there's no need for a coordinating office there anymore, which means the Turks want to kind of take back control. And if the Middle East no longer has any troops, then all of a sudden the entire military commitment we have in Germany, which is scrupulously designed to support Middle Eastern operations, falls into question. We're in a position today where we only have 3 large-scale deployments in the wider world, Japan, Korea, and Germany. And the German one is in danger, and the Korean one is in danger. Now, had this happened 30 years ago, you can bet that Herbert Walker Bush would have had a few things to say about it and probably would have moved some pieces around on the board. But that's not the world we're in. As of 3 years ago, the United States achieved net energy independence. So there's no longer an energy rationale for the U.S. being involved. And as we've seen in just the last month, that when oil prices hit 70, the shale operators kick into high gear and produce more. So any energy shocks we have in North America are small and limited. That just leaves the general argument of supporting the global structures of the order. Because the idea has been that, we will pay you to be on our side. And we realize that for you to function in the modern era, you need energy. So we've been in the Middle East to make sure that the energy can flow to our order allies. But there's no longer a security quid pro quo. And the idea that the United States is going to fight to keep the oil flows in the Persian Gulf open so that China can be the world's largest energy importer, that's a little dubious considering today's political environment. We're not just looking at American withdrawal from the Middle East and an end to the forever wars. We're looking at Americans retreating from maintaining what allows the rest of the world to function, because that's what makes sense domestically in the United States. And you could argue that it also makes strategic sense globally. That would require a deeper conversation that I've seen possible in not just the Biden administration, but the Trump administration and the Obama administration and the Clinton administration. And it's been a long time since Herbert Walker Bush was around.
I think that's a really important distinction, and not a lot of people view it that way. The idea that American power is so essential to undergirding this entire flow of energy across the world. An inability to reckon with the strategic unimportance for average Americans of this entire network.
It's a bit of a mind flip that the idea that the U.S. just doesn't need oil or just doesn't need the Middle East. I mean, it's so alien from what we've been hearing for the last 50 years, and for it to happen so quickly.
Of course, that brings up the question of energy independence, on which you've spoken a lot. Do you think that energy independence has been a major bipartisan through line in foreign policy? No.
It's not reflected in our foreign policy much at all. You got to remember, the United States is the least involved economy in the world in terms of as a percent of GDP. So it's been a long time since we've had to be interested in the wider world from an economic point of view. I mean, you have to go back to the previous, not just the 1900s, the 1800s. So we just, God, this sounds awful. We're just not educated on the topic, and that's okay. Because it's really not relevant to us. If we're interested in the wider world, the average American, it's because of travel. It's not because there's any sort of heavy dependence there. The things that the United States, for whatever reason, don't make are not things that we can't make. We have the capital, we have the technological know-how, we have the labor force. It's just that we've decided that in a globalized system, it's more efficient to do them elsewhere. So the products that the U.S. does make are ones that we're not just competitive in, but we're hyper competitive in. Whereas if they're made in China, it's an employment program, and they're the only things that they can make. If they could make the things the U.S. makes, they would. And so we're just honestly waiting for this kind of click in the average American psyche to take it all back. And Trump, while I'm sure a lot of people who are watching here have a lot of strong opinions about him, one of the things he absolutely got right is he changed the conversation on trade. He took it away from the guns for butter discussion of the order and made it just about economic issues. Now, we can argue that maybe he did it in the wrong way. You could make that argument about any president very easily. But he got us thinking about economics for economics, not as a means to a security end. And Biden has come in and basically doubled down on that. So all the sanctions that Trump put in place around the world are in place, with the exception of one set versus the Europeans on Airbus, which honestly were started 3 presidents ago. The direction that trade policy is taking under both presidents is much more firm, much more hard-knuckled, much more zero-sum game. And it's a game that, perfectly honest, the U.S. is very capable of playing.
So you feel that Donald Trump's presidency has changed the paradigm?
It's changed the conversation, certainly. His biggest weakness, of course, is he declares something, then he'd move over and play golf. And so nothing was really institutionalized. Biden is taking Trump policies and institutionalizing them.
Okay, so this is continuing. You don't anticipate there will be any return to the policies of the Obama administration, at least from a foreign policy perspective under Biden?
The Obama administration didn't have a foreign policy, so I don't think that's a fair question. Don't get me wrong. Just like there's 1,000 things about Trump that a lot of people don't care for. There's 1,000 things about Biden that people don't care for. But he actually has a foreign policy team that is making foreign policy, and we have not had that on a global scale since Herbert Walker Bush.
It's an interesting perspective. I did want to touch briefly on semiconductors, specifically in the context of China.
Sure.
I realize this is a bit of a curveball, but it is one of the things that America might have some difficulty